Have you ever heard this before? Nobody can keep all the commandments. Only Jesus can keep all the commandments. The commandments was given to show us that we couldn't keep all the commandments and that we need Jesus to do it. So he did it, so we don't have to. I've heard that a lot, different versions of that. Um, so here's some things to consider when it comes to that idea. First of all, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't believe that. Okay, I'm just gonna be upfront with you. Here's some things to consider before you choose to believe that. All right. In the King James Version, Moses testifies to Israel in Deuteronomy 30 that keeping Yahweh's written commandments and turning to him with all their heart and soul will not only result in the benefits named in that chapter, but also that hearing and doing them is not far off in heaven or beyond the sea. Instead, it is near, in their mouth and their heart, so that they can do it. It is Moses' testimony to Israel. You can do this. You can keep the commandments. You can do it. You have life. You have death. Choose life, and keep the commandments. It's not too hard. You can do it. That's the testimony of Moses in Deuteronomy 30, King James Version. All right. In the King James Version, Jesus of Nazareth says in Luke 16 that those who don't hear Moses and the prophets won't hear one raised from the dead. Keep in mind, later on in Luke 24, Jesus of Nazareth himself was raised from the dead. Okay? If you don't listen to Moses and the prophets, you're not going to listen to him. There are people who believe, or there are people who don't listen to Moses and the prophets, but they're convinced that they're following Jesus. So let's look at the benefits in the King James Version of Deuteronomy 30, 5 through 16. It's very similar to the very benefits Abraham enjoyed. Prosperity, farm life, wealth, health, protection by Yahweh. These are all things that Abraham encountered, and these are the very things that Deuteronomy 30, chapter 30, verse 5 through 16, promises to Israel. Very similar. Okay? And Yahweh's testimony in the King James Version of Genesis 26 is that Abraham obeyed Yahweh's voice, kept his charge, his commandments, his statutes, and his laws. This is what Yahweh says Abraham did. That, to me, that sounds like they were in his heart and in his mouth. Like, this is what Abraham was about. This is how Abraham lived. And this is the very thing that Moses is presenting to Israel as, hey, be like this. You can do it. Now, according to Yahweh, Abraham did it. And Moses is telling Israel, you can do it. All right? In the King James Version of 1 Kings chapter 2, David describes to Solomon, his son, how to be a man. And the description is pretty much to live the same as the life of Abraham. He's telling Solomon to live the way Abraham lived. He didn't say live as Abraham lived, but the things he told Solomon to do is the same things that Abraham did. And it's the same things that Moses is encouraging Israel to do. Okay? Now in First Kings chapter 15, verse 5, again, you have Yahweh testifying, but this time, instead of testifying about Abraham, he's testifying about David. And he says that David did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And then that same book, 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 2, says that David's descendant, Josiah, did the same thing. Not the bad thing with Uriah, but as far as staying focused and keeping the law and not turning to the left or the right. Now, imagine Abraham or David as a kid. They never told a lie. They never stole anything. They was never hard-headed. They lived a perfect life. No. The law requires a person to atone for their sin. Make sacrifices. All right? Abraham is recorded as making burnt offerings. And the Torah tells Israel to make burnt offerings, which means David participated in this as well. But when it came to that Bathsheba incident, every step along the way, David didn't atone for his sin. He never went to the Levite, confessed, repented, sought forgiveness. He saw the woman. He should have turned away, but he looked, and next thing you know, he's involved with her. He should have turned away, repented, went to the priest, atoned for his sin, sought forgiveness, but instead she got pregnant. Now he's trying to cover it up, calling the guy out from off the battlefield to cover up his sin, to cover up David's sin. He's calling Uriah to cover up David's sin. And when Uriah wouldn't get on board with the idea, he had Uriah murdered. All this time, he could have went to the priest and said, man, I'm way off course. I'm wrong. I need to be forgiven. Nah, he forsook the law. He turned away. He said, I'm not doing it. The dude is dead. Now he's marrying Uriah's pregnant wife. And everybody's looking like, oh, what a gesture. Oh, what a kind thing David is doing. Nah, David was trying to cover up his sin, and he had moved on with his life with the cover-up. Turned away from the law and was living lawless. And Yahweh sent a prophet to pretty much put David on blast. And that's when Yahweh said, I'm killing your child because of what you did. Then David's heart was turned. Okay? So, come to think of it, I don't know if David's heart was turned before or after Yahweh said he was going to kill the baby. I got to go back and look. But what I do know is, up until the time David was confronted by the prophet, there's no indication that David had any intention whatsoever in atoning for his sin. Mind you, every year, the law requires you to afflict your soul for your sin and then make a sacrifice to atone for it. So when the Day of Atonement comes around, what is David doing? He ain't afflicting his soul for murdering Uriah, confessing his sin, committing adultery, conspiracy, everything. David had turned away from the law. He forsook the law that one time. And Yahweh said, yeah, he did everything right except for that one time he forsook the law. All right? But can we all agree? David didn't have to do that mess. That was a choice. He didn't have to do that. He could have kept the law. He chose not to. Okay? Although Yahweh refers to David as someone who did that which was right in Yahweh's sight, in Acts 13:22 in the King James Version, Paul refers to David's life and commitment this way. He said David fulfilled all Yahweh's will. So you have in Kings, a reference to David's life is he did that which was right in Yahweh's sight. But in Acts, the very same David, the very same life is referred to this way. He fulfilled all Yahweh's will. Okay? Yahweh's will is the Torah. We know that. That's Psalms chapter 40, verse 8. We already know what Yahweh's will is. When thy kingdom come, thy will be done. We know what his will is. It's the Torah. Psalms 48 says it. All right? In that Acts passage, in Acts 13, Paul says that John the Baptist fulfilled his course. That's verse 25. He says that those in Jerusalem fulfilled the prophets by condemning Yeshua in verse 27, and all that was written of Yeshua in verse 29. And then he says that Yahweh fulfilled his promise in verse 33. So in Acts 13, there's a lot of fulfilled talk going on. This person fulfilled, that person fulfilled, fulfill. All right? So we realize that doing that which is right in the eyes of Yahweh and turning not aside from anything that is commanded and fulfilling all Yahweh's will, okay, are two descriptions of David's life, his commitment, which would mean that should be able to be said about Abraham. Abraham did that, and Abraham didn't even get nobody murdered. It says that Josiah did that in 1 Kings 22. So Josiah did it too. All right? When you talk about Yeshua or Jesus of Nazareth, He came and fulfilled all Yahweh's will. In other words, he kept the laws, the statutes, the judgments, etc. That's what he said he came to do in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Okay? Yahweh's will is the Torah. Remember that. Psalm 40, verse 8. So I'm going to say it this way to make it easy. Yahweh's will is at least the Torah. We know that much. Maybe his will is some more stuff, but we definitely know it's the Torah. At least that. Yeshua taught that abiding in his love, that's for people who are keeping the commandments, keeping the Torah. That's John chapter 15, verse 10. So when you're talking about abiding in his love or abiding in the love of the Father, that's something that's being referred to. That's something that's being associated with the people who keep the commandments. Okay, that's not about people who aren't keeping the commandments. There's no people. We're not keeping the commandments, but we're abiding in his love. There's no such thing as that. I don't think. I could be wrong. I don't know if I've ever seen anything that supports that idea. All right. Even when it comes to just loving him, loving Yeshua, loving Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, the Messiah. John chapter 14, verse 15 and verse 21. If you're not keeping the commandments, there's no such thing as loving him for you. If you're loving him, you got to be somebody who's keeping the commandments. Okay? If I'm understanding this correctly, which I might be not understanding it correctly. So there are a lot of people who associate the epistles of John with John, the disciple of Yeshua. Okay? A lot of people believe that guy wrote those epistles. According to those epistles, if you're not keeping the commandments, you don't even know Yeshua. You're a lie. You're a liar. That's what this guy whoever wrote this, people believe that the disciple wrote it. So if a disciple wrote it, then this is something that he's speaking on as a student of Yeshua, saying, if you don't keep the commandments, you don't even know him. Okay? Hold on a second.
Freeman Jarrett.
What's up, man?
Hey, Dad, you at the house right now?
Nope.
Okay, never mind.
You all right?
Yeah, I was picking up some Roscoe's probably, but I didn't know if you were home or not.
Roscoe's?
Roscoe's, yeah.
Wow. Hey, call Kia.
Okay.
I love you. Thank you.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Roscoe's. All right. Anyways. All right. So you don't keep the commandments. You don't know him. And if you got that idea coming out of your mouth, it's a lie. This is what's being taught in the epistle. 1 John chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. The idea of asking or submitting prayers and having those prayers answered, those prayer requests answered. 1 John chapter 3, verse 22. Again, this is the same writer. He said, nah, you're not keeping the commandments. That's off the table. Even Yeshua himself in John 15, chapter 15, verse 7, same idea. No, answer prayer and you're not keeping the commandments, off the table. It's off the table. There's so many teachings and songs and things about dwelling in him and him dwelling in us and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. You hear all this terminology, but in 1 John chapter 3, verse 24, if you're not keeping the commandments, that's off the table. There is no dwelling in him for you. There is no him dwelling in you or you dwelling in him or the Spirit dwelling in you. If you're not keeping the commandments, you're not even part of that experience. That's not even talking about you. And if you perceive that that is the case, that might be erroneous. That might be absolutely not true. Okay? If I'm understanding what's being presented in these passages correctly, and if what's being presented in these passages is absolutely true and absolutely right. Okay? When it comes to loving Yahweh or loving the children of Yahweh, again, 1 John chapter 5, verse 2 and 3. If you're not keeping the commandments, that's off the table. That's not something that's going on with you. Loving Yahweh and loving the children of Yahweh, that's something that is named among those who keep the commandments. If I'm understanding this correctly. Even when it comes to love itself, just love. What is love? Now, growing up, Sunday school, church, VBS, Vacation Bible School, I grew up in Christian school. I was a musician in church for years, but actually identifying sin as transgression of the Torah, it wasn't a popular thing. When people say repent from your sin, very seldom do they mean turn away from transgressing the Torah and start keeping the commandments. Very seldom. However, sin is transgression of the Torah. If it don't transgress the Torah, it's not sin. At the same time, what is love? I love God. I love Jesus. I love everybody. According to 2 John chapter 1, verse 6, love is keeping the commandments. I just don't remember that being taught like that. However, if this passage is correct, and if I'm understanding it correct, and if it's absolutely right and absolutely true, then love is keeping the commandments. 2 John chapter 1, verse 6. Okay? So all of these things that I'm naming, knowing him, asking prayer requests and getting them answered, him dwelling in us dwelling in him, the Spirit dwelling in us, loving Yahweh, loving the children of Yahweh. These are all things that exist among those who keep the commandments. It's not really taught like that's what's going on with people who don't keep the commandments. All right? So, the Torah is to be kept and taught. Well, Yeshua in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, makes it very clear that those who keep the commandments and teach others to keep the commandments are called great by him. Now, he didn't actually say great by him, actually. He just said great in the kingdom of heaven, but he later ascended to the kingdom of heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. So if you believe that he ascended to heaven and that he's at the right hand of the Father, then if you're keeping the commandments and you're teaching other people to keep the commandments, he's referring to you as great. He's saying you're great. Okay? Now, there's also a reference to people who don't keep the commandments and don't teach other people to keep the commandments. And he refers to them in that same passage as least. Okay? Now, here's something that people don't consider. People who don't keep the commandments and don't teach others to keep the commandments, because he actually told his disciples, go baptize and teach people to obey all the commandments. If you don't do that, then you're not being a disciple, or you're not being the disciple he commanded his disciples to be. But there will be people on the last day who show up and go, Lord, it's me. I'm one of your folks. I did a bunch of stuff in your name. And if they didn't do what he told them to do, then not only are they going to be called least, but they're going to be sent away. That's Matthew chapter 7, verse 23. They're not just called, it's not like, hey, you know what? You're one of the least, but come on in. No. The least will be sent away. Depart from me. The least will be called by him lawless, or worker of iniquity, which is opposite of lawful. No, lawless. They'll be turned away, and he will say, I never knew you. There's no relationship. You're an outsider. You're a stranger. You was never on the team. So, and then in 1 John chapter 2, verse 4, he chimes in, oh, and they're a liar too. So if you don't keep the commandments and you don't teach other people to keep the commandments, what should you expect? What should you expect from him? You should expect for him to call you the least. You should expect for him to turn you away. You should expect for him to call you lawless. And you should expect for him to deny that there was ever any type of relationship or knowledge of him and you, period. And then John's going to say, oh, and he's a liar too. That's what, at least if I'm understanding this correctly, this is what you should expect. Okay? Now, I've read the book of Acts a couple of times. I've kind of paid some attention to what's going on with Paul. And from what I can see, Paul went out of his way and he intended to be viewed as one who kept and taught the Torah. Especially if you look at Acts 21, verses 20 through 24. He went out of his way to be viewed as someone who kept the Torah and taught others to keep the Torah. In Acts chapter 21, there was a rumor floating around that maybe he was teaching something different than that. Maybe he was teaching not to keep all the commandments. Maybe he was teaching people to do something different. And between him and the other apostle, who I believe his name was really Yaakov, but they say James, the decision was made. The rumor is floating around that you are not keeping the commandments and teaching other people to keep the commandments. All of them. So go and participate in a ceremonial law ritual. Don't just participate, bro. Come out the pocket. Make a financial commitment to it. To a Levite priest. Remember, this is after Yeshua made the sacrifice once and for all and rose and atoned for our sin. This is a conversation among disciples who preach that. And they're saying, go participate in a ceremonial law, come out of the pocket, make a financial commitment, a statement. Okay? Shave your head. So now you're participating in a ceremonial law, you're making a financial commitment, and you're literally physically doing something to yourself that everybody can see this guy's not playing around. He literally shaves off his hair and make an animal sacrifice. Were you raised to believe that disciples of Yeshua would make an animal sacrifice? I was never raised to believe that. But in Acts 21, it's there. Hey, animal sacrifice. This is part of what's going on. And he did all these things for the purpose of disassociating himself with the very thought that he came to do anything that would destroy or nullify or diminish any of the law. Not a jot, not a tittle. None of it. Man, that sounds familiar. This is how Acts presents the Apostle Paul. Was this really how Paul was? I don't know Paul. But at least the writer of Acts seems to put him out there like he was really committed to making absolutely sure that he was the type of disciple that Yeshua would look down from heaven and say, he is a great teacher. He keeps the law and he teaches other people to keep the law. Okay? So, the people that I'm addressing in this video, they're all examples of, in my opinion, what it looks like if you are able to keep the commandments. Abraham was able to keep the commandments. David was able to keep the commandments. Josiah was able to keep the commandments. According to Moses, Israel was able to keep the commandments. Yeshua was able to keep the commandments. And Paul tried to present himself as someone who was able to keep the commandments. Okay? David told his son Solomon, hey, keep all the commandments. Do it. You can do it, bro. Right? What loving father would tell his son to do something that he was incapable of doing? Anyways, not only did Moses testify that it could or should be done, but the writer of 1 John chapter 5, verse 3 says that keeping Yahweh's commandments isn't too hard for those who actually love him, which agrees with the testimony of Moses. Moses said what? fear Yahweh, keep his commandments, love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? And then the writer of 1 John chapter 5:3 is saying, yeah, for those who actually really love him, keeping his commandments isn't hard. Maybe that has something to do with my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Maybe. I don't know. But this is a testimony that's in agreement. So we have people who at times add traditional doctrines or applications to the teaching and practicing of keeping the law and commandments. They add extra stuff. Now, in certain circles, they call that Talmudic, or extra stuff, extra traditions, extra crap that wasn't already there. Some extra stuff people added to it. Okay? Now, according to the teaching of Yeshua, of Jesus of Nazareth, when you add extra stuff, it can nullify Yahweh's word. That's Mark 7:15. He literally told him, your extra stuff is nullifying Yahweh's word. Nullify. Wow, that's not good. Nullify sounds like it's watering it down, canceling it out, taking the kick out of it, And in Matthew chapter 15, verse 6, he says that the extra stuff compromises the effectiveness of the Torah, or the law, or the commandments. So the extra stuff nullifies the word of Yahweh. The extra stuff compromises the effectiveness. That's Mark 7:15 and Matthew 15:6. This is the teaching of Jesus. If you're a disciple of Jesus or of Yeshua, this is curriculum. This is what you're supposed to be teaching. Remember, teach everybody to obey everything I commanded. So when he says these things, is he commanding us to use extra stuff? Is he saying, hey, extra stuff, man, that's a good look, do that? Or is he saying, hey, the extra stuff nullifies the word of Yahweh. The extra stuff makes the laws and the commandments ineffective. His sheep hear his voice. What is his voice saying? That's a legitimate question. All right. So, according to Peter in Acts chapter 15, verse 10, nobody's able to bear all the extra stuff. Nobody's able to bear it. In Acts 15, you got guys who are trying to preach circumcision in a way that Moses didn't preach it. None of the prophets preached it. Yeshua didn't preach circumcision like that. But you have these guys telling people you can't even be on the team until you get circumcised. But that's never what circumcision was, ever. Circumcision was always something that came after being on the team. Yahweh called Abraham out, made promises to him, had a relationship with him, and then Abraham was circumcised. Israelites who had people coming in from the outside who weren't born Israelites, they came in, and once they were part of Israel, then they received the seal. There were people who weren't even circumcised when Passover time came around, and they had to sit out. Hey, you're not circumcised yet. Well, you part of Israel, but you're not circumcised yet. You can't come into the holy place yet. There's still a seal you need to receive. But it was never, you can't even be part of this until you're circumcised. That was a doctrine that came from the extra stuff. And who was the main person speaking against it in Acts 15? Paul. Breaking the rules. Paul spoke against it. All right? So Peter is saying, man, that nobody can handle all that extra stuff. We was raised in a synagogue every Sabbath. We can't even handle all that extra crap. It doesn't make any sense to put this on people who wasn't even raised like we were. So the conclusion was not to put the extra crap on the Gentiles. All right? But instead, tell them the very same thing that Torah tells brand new people. There's certain things that are deal breakers. There's things that are off the table. No idolatry, no fornication, and don't eat stuff you ain't got no business eating. Okay, you can't bring that in. You got to leave that at the door. So, being unable to handle all the extra crap is very different than the Torah, which we are easily able to do. Well, at least Moses and the prophets and Yeshua and the apostles appear to be saying that we can do it. Don't confuse the impossibility of doing all the extra crap versus the ability of being able to keep the commandments or keep the Torah. They're not the same. Many people use writings attributed to Paul to promote the ideology that doesn't agree with the significance Torah keeping is given by Moses, the prophets, Yeshua, the epistles of John, or the testimony of Paul presented in Acts. Okay? They take writings, they say Paul wrote it, and then they use those writings to promote stuff that doesn't agree with what Moses and everybody else said. Even what Paul said, even what Paul lived. They do that. It's questionable whether or not these folks even give any consideration to the effort that was made by Paul himself to disassociate his teaching and his lifestyle with any variance from the laws, practices, and customs of the Torah. When people associate the writings of Paul with these other ideas, with this extra crap that nobody was teaching, they never consider the effort Paul made in Acts to say, nah, don't associate me with that. Do not even think that I came to do that. I'm not part of that. That's not me. It seems like there's no thought or consideration given to that at all. Okay, so what do we do with these writings? Well, we can either read these writings and understand them in a way that says Paul is someone who is committed to not only keeping the law, but teaching others to keep the law. All of it. Even the Gentiles. Yes, even the Gentiles. Yeshua did not say the person who keeps the law and teaches others who are not Gentiles. He said teaches others. When he gave the commandment, Matthew 28, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded, there's no parentheses that says except the Gentiles. Okay? So what you got to realize is Gentiles who are coming into the faith, they're brand new. They're kindergarten. So you don't dump everything on their head the first day and say, man, you got to keep all this. No, what you do is it's a curriculum, just like it is in the Torah. There are things that you're supposed to teach and practice and learn, and you're going to drop the ball, and you're going to atone for, and you're going to keep, and you're going to practice, and you're going to uphold, and you're going to grow. Okay? The things that were written in that letter to the Gentiles in Acts 15, that's Torah stuff. It's entry-level Torah stuff. It's, hey, you brand new, so here's what you need to understand right off top. Right off top. No fornication, no idolatry, and no eating crap you ain't supposed to be eating. Right off top. Okay? If you read and study the Torah, what you realize is violation of those things will have you either executed or cut off from Israel. They are non-negotiable. Can't bring that in. So what they were actually telling the Gentiles is in keeping with the instruction given by Yeshua. Teach them to obey everything. But Yeshua never told them to teach them to obey Talmudic extra crap. Never. Not then, not today. All the extra crap that's being promoted and trying to be packaged in with Yeshua, that ain't nothing that's supposed to be taught with him. Okay? So beware of any message or messenger that tells you that you cannot keep the commandments. Beware. You can. It's not too difficult. It can be written on your heart and manifested in your behavior, just like it was for Abraham, David, Josiah, Yeshua, Paul, the one that's testified of in the book of Acts. You can do it. It can be done. You're commanded by Yeshua to do it if you are a disciple, and to teach others to do it if you're a disciple. There is no special group of people who are not supposed to be taught to do it. That is a lie. I think that's a lie. Find out if that's a lie. And if you find writings that would make you comfortable, maybe not keeping the commandments, or maybe not teaching people to keep the commandments, who would introduce theology that would cause a person to be comfortable not doing or not following the clear laid out instructions? Read Genesis 3. That's how we got into this mess. Clear laid out instructions. All they had to do was be followed. But somebody showed up with a theology that made people more comfortable not doing what they were supposed to do. Who is the person behind such theology? the serpent. So, anything I offer or say that's absolutely true and absolutely right, determine what role that should play in your decision making. Okay? Anything I'm saying that's not absolutely true or not absolutely right, I don't know what to tell you to do with that. Maybe throw it in the trash can.